When the estate lawyer cleared his throat and read the words out loud, it felt like being slapped awake in the middle of a funeral I didn't know I was attending. My daughter, Catherine Lane, shall be entitled to the residual estate provided that she lives continuously without a fixed residence for 30 consecutive days, as defined herein. Failure to complete the 30-day period will result in forfeiture of the residual estate to be distributed as set forth in Schedule D. The phrase that made the room tilt like a ship in a storm, lives continuously without a fixed residence for 30 consecutive days. The alternative, delivered in the same clipped voice of the lawyer, was worse, or get nothing. I had expected oddities in my father's will. He had always been theatrical, grand gifts announced with the flourish of a man who loved the stage. He had surprises tucked into ordinary days the way someone else might tuck love notes. But this read like a dare written on thick legal paper. The media had already started a low hum just outside the private room at the firm. The soft clack of boots, the camera shutters being checked, the metallic scent of coffee cups being distributed like props at a play. My brothers, Robert and Alan, sat with expressions arranged on faces that practically begged for outrage. Their mouths were fine-tuned to the currency of indignation. They sharpened it when the lights were on. Ellis stood behind me in the room, taller than his years, that estate manager posture, like a man who had spent half his life corralling horses and the other half corralling my father's moods. His hand found the back of my suit jacket, a small, steadying weight. He'd been with my father before I was old enough to pronounce inheritance, and he looked now like a man who had seen his employer in every extreme and somehow expected extremes. Live homeless for 30 days or get nothing, I echoed in my head. The words tasted like iron. Is this, Alan started, his voice syrup-sweet, is this legally enforceable? 100 things could have happened next. A judge might laugh it out. Someone could have offered $1 million hush to buy me my dignity back. A family member could have stood up and declared the will invalid on any number of convenient tear-splashed grounds. Instead, the lawyer, a precise woman named Marlowe, laid out the parameters with the same removal as she read the will. It's been drafted with care, she said. Mr. Lane anticipated challenges. There are conditions, consecutive days, independent witnesses, affidavits confirming continuous lack of a fixed residence. He established an administrator to monitor compliance. We're prepared for contest should that be necessary. She nodded toward a slender envelope on the table. Mr. Lane left instructions for your first contact. The envelope contains a device and a drive. He recorded messages, missives, intended to be viewed during the period, and he named a custodian, Mr. Ellis, who knows where to direct you. The room shifted. Reporters were not yet inside, but their absence seemed like a held breath. I thought of the last time I'd seen my father, 2 months before, at his study, the leather smell and the ashtray that never had ash in it. His hands had been small then, folded like paper in a newspaper. He'd looked at me and said something that had sounded like a joke and like an apology. "You don't know what the world smells like, Cat. That's my fault." He'd always called me Cat. I felt 18 again, and small, and furious at him for a million quiet reasons. "You actually mean for me to become homeless?" Robert said aloud, all polite astonishment. "Is this morality theater? Some performance piece?" "It's a test," Marlowe said, cool and final. The word test is a small thing. It implies evaluation, a set of standards. It also implies a teacher. The memory of my father, of his cold, impatient love, shifted toward the shape it had tonight. Less a father than a man who had believed he could sculpt other people by making them bleed, then offering plaster. Somewhere in him, there had been a plan. I resented it. I feared it. And in a way, I wanted to meet it head on. I told myself I would do it as an insult. I would prove him wrong. I would live in the city, meet people worse off than I was, then come back and laugh while Robert and Alan floundered through their lawsuits. If I had to, I'd accept the humiliation and turn it into leverage. I had been raised on leverage. Then I accept, I said before I could be clever. The words landed in the room with the soft authority of someone signing a document they couldn't unsign. There it was, the first of many moments when choice felt less like freedom and more like being nudged onto a track and told to run. The lawyer's pen moved. The administrator made notes in a ledger that had been dog-eared and probably used as a weapon in a dozen other family fights. Ellis led me from the room with the envelope in my hand. Outside, the world had one of those rare slants of afternoon light that made everything feel cinematic and uncomfortably public. A reporter lurched forward, camera clicking. I put the envelope in my bag and tried to breathe. If you've ever wondered what you'd do for an inheritance like this, what lengths you'd go to, think about your answer for a moment. The reason I ask is that the moment you decide becomes a doorway you can't unsee. I walked out into a city that had never looked stranger. My phone started ringing immediately. Offers I could have expected. PR guys promising to spin me into a saint. A rival cousin with a sympathetic Twitter meltdown already in progress. Family lawyers with estimates of my future legal bills. Robert's assistant texted, "Call Bobby, he's on his way to talk options." Alan tweeted a half-hearted defense of our father's eccentricity. The sound of my private life being salted in public made me nauseous. The first video was in the envelope. It was a small hard drive, labeled in my father's precise hand, Day 1 for Catherine, watch once, in full, no comments. I thought he'd be theatrical with words. I hadn't expected the flat, careful way he had arranged his last theater. A camera set up in his study, light softened, his face familiar and weathered. He looked directly into the lens, and the angle of the chair made his statement feel like an accusation. "Catherine," he said, and it was exactly like being told a truth through a keyhole. "You always asked me why I did what I did. I'm not going to tell you everything now. This will be enough to begin." His eyes narrowed, not unkindly. "There are things in this house and in the land that will tell you more than I will. But first, the test. I did not design it to be cruelty. I designed it to hurt in a way that might make you listen." He looked older than any memory allowed. He reached for a cigarette, then put it down. The movement was human, endearing, infuriating. "You will be watched," he said, "not for your shame, but because there are those who would take everything in your name. I expect you will be tempted to use what you have to make the rules void. Don't. Follow them. They matter more than money." He paused, and something like apology flickered across his face. "If you complete 30 days, there is more. There is a room. There are papers. There are instructions on how to handle what I leave you. If you fail, well, you know my temper. Make something out of it, Kat. Be better." The tape stopped. The laptop screen went black. For a moment, I seemed to be only a collection of sounds, my own breathing, Ellis's shoes on marble, the faint hum of air conditioning. I had been raised to believe that money afforded a cushion between the world and what the world hurt. The cushion had been snatched. That night, I walked until I found the edge of my neighborhood where the lights dimmed and the train smelled of metal and old rain. I did not go to my brownstone. I did not call my driver. I sat on a bench for a long time and watched the city move without me, like a film where I was merely a prop. I had packed a small bag, an ostentatiously small protest against the test, a couple changes of clothing, a toothbrush, a thin sweater. I had some cash. I had a phone with battery life that felt like a luxury. For the first night, I intended to treat this as a game, an improvised performance one of my father's eccentricities demanded. The first rain found me and soaked me through. It is strange the way humiliation and cold become one sensation, immediate, physical, acute. I ducked into the doorway of a closed shop and pulled my knees up to my chest. People hurried past with umbrellas and indifference. I felt the thinness of the barrier between me and people I had never noticed before, men and women who had been there always, whose tables the world kept moving. Toward dawn, two things happened that would change the tone of the test for me. The first was a man in an orange safety vest who offered me a foil blanket and a sealed sandwich. He had quiet eyes and the air of a man who did not wish to observe others' discomfort, but had learned, through practice, how to interrupt it. He found no sign of me being special. To him, I was a person with hypothermia as a potential future problem. He shrugged at my protest and left the sandwich on my lap. "Eat," he said. "You'll think clearer." I did. The second was a young woman who sat beside me and lit a cigarette with fingers that trembled from cold and nerves. Her name was Maria. She wasn't on the street by choice. She had been laid off when the factory closed and became mired in the thin, bureaucratic web that steals dignity and time. We talked like strangers who were given permission to be honest. She told me her daughters were with an aunt in Jersey. She had not seen them in months. "You don't want to be here," I said, because when one is suddenly poor in a city of wealth, one's first impulse is explanation. "No," she said, "but here is where people notice you less. It's less expensive that way." She smiled a small thing, half brave, half broken. "Try to keep your feet dry if you can." There had been a million things I didn't know. For all my father's wealth, he had not made me wise about these things. He had insulated me so completely that the texture of scarcity was something I had only read about, experienced like one experiences colors on a screen. Night 2, I went to a shelter. There was a quiet order to the place. Time slots for dinner, intake forms, a cinder block smell offset by coffee. People lined up and allowed themselves to be counted. The woman at the intake desk took my bag without judgment and offered me a bunk for the night. Rules, roll call, lights out. I had expected humiliation. Instead, there was the peculiar relief of being unmentioned for a while. The man who snored 3 bunks down told stories to the next man, stories that had no beginning and no end, stories of cities and songs, and a wife that might or might not be real. I listened. Sometimes listening is an act of mercy. During the day, Alan called with a new offer. They had found an attorney, a big firm with names that sounded like monuments. They wanted me to negotiate. They would pay me, they said, to walk away discreetly. Robert, with his practiced charm, called and spoke slow and kind on the phone. He asked whether I had thought about our mother, whether I had considered that the suit might be a risk to the family name. It felt like someone trying to sell me an insurance policy in a language I had always spoken. "You can sign over your rights," Robert said. "We can set up trusts that honor Father's memory and keep our charitable aims intact without this strange theater. There's no shame in avoiding spectacle." "What are you afraid I'll do, Bobby?" I asked. "Start a scandal? Or worse, learn something you don't want me to know?" There was a pause heavy with a history I had not been privy to. Half-truths tucked in envelopes, business deals done in the soft light of a yacht's cabin. I hung up. I shoved my phone deep in my pocket and went to the library of a public community center and sat by the window, watching people sweep the streets with tender, bureaucratic hands. Day 5's video arrived in the second envelope with a small note. When you're hungry and tired, watch this. The recording was different. My father sat on a bench in a park I've never been to. His coat flapped by wind, the city behind him like a backdrop. He told a story about a man he'd met when he was younger, an encounter that had been brief but had lodged in him like a splinter. He asked me for a handout, my father said, and the way he referred to the man, without a name, made the story both intimate and anonymous. I gave him the money he asked for because it was a fast sort of compassion, the kind that does nothing to change the architecture of suffering. Later, I watched him use that handout to buy something that would help him for a time, but not forever. I realized then that a test of character is not what you do with the first opportunity to be generous. It is how you build systems that do that work for you. It was the first hint of the larger pattern he'd set in motion. The will wasn't merely about humiliation. It seemed to be a filter for something else, perhaps a stewardship test. There were ironies that tasted like pennies. A man who made his money off extraction and land, now requiring a child to live homeless in order to inherit. There must be a reason. The video ended with a hard instruction. Don't let them buy you, he said. Don't let them buy anyone in your name. Find Ellis. He has something for you when the time is right. It felt like a map without a destination. But if there was one person I trusted in the house of flawed loyalty my father had designed, it was Ellis. On day 8, I met a young man named Tony in an alley behind a soup kitchen. He had a skateboard and hands that had once been smoother than they were now. He told me about an art class he'd once taken before life had knocked him into survival. He was a sketch artist of the kind who made the city's under edges look like a gallery. You don't have to be angry, he told me, when I said something bitter about my brothers. You can be clever with your anger, turn it into design, make something that isn't them. He looked at my hands. You're the kind who can do that, he said, if you want. I had never thought of myself as an artist. My hands had always been expected to write checks, to sign approvals. In the shower stall, standing with towels like flags, I remembered an easel I'd once used, years ago, a single room in a rented apartment where I had painted wildly and badly, the kind of mistakes that feel like proof you are alive. I had given that away when the marriage wore neat and then frayed. My father had been disappointed with my paints, and I had folded that disappointment inward like another envelope. When I told Ellis about the last video, he nodded the way people do when they keep secrets as a kind of duty. I always said he had a plan, Ellis said. He led me one afternoon to a part of the estate that the public had never seen. Through a side door of the library, past stacks of ledgers and maps, down a flight of steps that smelled of dust and oil. The light thinned, then disappeared, and there was a small metal door set into the stone, a handle worn like a thumb. This is what he meant by a room, Ellis said. He had it built years ago. Not a bunker for guns, God knows he had those if he wanted them, but a room for papers, for truth. He pushed the door. Inside, the air was cool, and there were shelves lined with boxes and binders. At the far wall, a desk held a laptop and a single thick file, stamped with a name I did not know, but a word I did. Mitchell Oil, transfer 2009. The more people who knew things like this, the less they were able to manipulate it. That had to be my father's logic. Hide the map, hand it to a child who had been dulled by privilege, and watch whether the child could do anything beyond being stunned. I opened the first binder. It contained correspondence, Emails, dated, with signatures and numbers, and a specific kind of small cruelty lawyers write when they want to look like reality. There were testaments to meetings in which my brothers had signed as witnesses, names I recognized as board members, figures that suggested deals had been structured in ways that raised questions that might wind back to environmental neglect. Pages, then, that would be trouble if they met the cold logic of a judge. A clatter sounded outside the door. My phone, insistent, Robert, Allen, another attorney's name. The world had begun to converge on one point, the possibility that the will could be challenged, that assets were as slippery as shadow. I don't want to be the person who uses his death to score points, I said, though it sounded like the lie I had told myself for years. If these are incriminating on their face, we need to be careful. We can't just throw them in the press. Ellis put a gentle hand on my shoulder. He didn't leave you just evidence, Kat. He left you pieces of himself. He trusted you in ways he never trusted anyone else to protect what his name built, for better or worse. If you're careful, you can use the room to keep him honest. That night, lying in the back of a volunteer-run clinic because the shelter had run out of space, I thought about the war room. It felt both grander and smaller than the conspiracy theories I'd spun in my head. There were stacks of paper, an old man's careful ordering of his affairs, and the possibility that truth could be wielded not as a weapon, but as a lever. That was a kind of tenderness I could not have expected. On day 10, there was an email from Marlowe. The brothers had filed a motion asking for a temporary restraining order, an injunction to keep the estate from being distributed until the court could decide on the will's enforceability. The language was dry, the implications far-reaching. In the equation of what I had to lose, getting cold and homeless suddenly became less an emotional endurance and more a tactical move. If the court froze the assets pending litigation, I might pass the 30 days and still not see a penny. The administrator's notes might have been meticulous. The law might prove stubbornly literal. Everything was a race. My presence on the streets, my completion of the test, the lawyer's motions. It felt less like a lesson and more like a gauntlet. Robert called again with the offer to negotiate, this time with a number attached and a schedule for how the public would be managed. Walk away, he said. Keep some dignity. We can set up a foundation in his name. You don't have to go through more spectacle. There was a helpless smallness to this. I had to admit grudgingly that my father's strategy was effective. He had designed a test that would both expose me and protect what he considered sacred. He had not done it to humiliate me for amusement. He had done it to force me towards something I could not have reached on my own. I flinched at the way his voice still held the belief that he could fix me by trimming away comfort. As the 10th day ended, I sat on a stoop and watched the city prepare for evening. A woman setting up a small pile of blankets smiled and offered me tea. A cop walked past with a tired expression that told me he had seen a lot and judged very little today. Tony sent a picture of a charcoal sketch he'd made of me, leaning against an old fence, my hair back, eyes sharp. For whatever reason, seeing myself through someone else's hand made me feel less like an actor and more like a person who might change. I had completed 10 days. I had watched the videos my father sent, a total of 5 so far, each one a sliver of instruction, a fragment that pulled me forward and then stepped back. The war room lay under my feet like a secret that could explode. My brothers were sharpening legal knives. The public had started to hunger for spectacle. Inside the war room, I had found not only files, but a small packet with my name on it, Catherine, for day 16. My father's handwriting had a consistent slope, like a road. The packet contained a photograph of a stable, the old Lane farm I'd visited as a child, with its blue barn and cracked fence, and a key taped to the back. Ellis found me that night under an overpass where the shelters could not stretch. His face was the kind of tired that comes from choosing a side and holding it. He handed me a thermos and sat without asking. "You could break this agreement in a dozen ways," he said quietly, like a man who had read the lines of a play many times over. "You could sign away your rights, you could settle, you could let the court do what courts do, or you could finish it. I'll help you keep what he wanted you to keep." "Are you on his side or mine?" I asked. He shrugged. "I was on his side. Now I'm on the side of what's left of him. And you're a difficult, dreadful woman who needs someone to hold her when she gets lost. I'll do that." The key he'd given me had a blue ribbon and a tag that read, "For the barn, open when you can." I slept poorly that night because sleep at the edge of society is its own kind of noise. I thought of my father's face in the videos, the challenge in his gaze. He had wanted me to feel the world. He had wanted me to be accountable for it and for the consequences of our family's wealth. I did not know whether I would answer his test in a way he approved. I only knew that something inside me had shifted from irritation to curiosity to something like resolve. The morning after I found the key, I stood on a platform waiting for a commuter train heading out of the city. I rode with a man who was a bus driver and a painter on his days off. He told me about his mother's hands and their stubbornness. A woman offered me half her sandwich because she said sharing food is the simplest rebellion against fear. When we passed the farmland, I felt the familiar pull of home. The Lane estate had been a hulking, well-tended presence in my childhood memories. I had spent holidays among the horses and the light that shone through the barn doors like a halo. My father had owned more land than I'd ever be capable of measuring. He'd made money from investments, from risky oil ventures that had grown into a company whispered about for its ruthlessness and its success. The land carried scars, a long scar of the pipeline, a sheen in a creek once that people said had been the sign of greed. I thought about all of that in the way you might think about a house on fire, abstractly, until you see the flames and realize you know where everyone keeps the photo albums. On the 15th night, the war room packet opened like a new beginning. The key fit the lock of the blue barn's padlock with a satisfying click. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and old leather. It was not as tidy as it had been in my memories. But in a corner, under a dust sheet, Ellis had arranged another small box. Inside the box were more files, but also a canvas, edges crusted with dried paint, and a small set of brushes. There's a moment when you realize a test is less about what you lose and more about what is being offered to you. For my father, perhaps art was an odd offering. For me, it was a homecoming to something I had abandoned. The brushes felt like an accusation and a solace. I had not yet completed the 30 days. The brothers' motion in court threatened to freeze everything. The public was ravenous for the scandal, but in the barn, stacked in a file marked "For Catherine, Evidence," I found a ledger with names and figures and a series of letters that suggested the Mitchells, my brother's partners, had moved money in a way that could be opened in court. The war room had been a bank of truths, and truth has a way of making people rearrange their faces. As I sat on a bale of hay and breathed in the smell of dust and possibility, I felt the world narrow to a point where decisions were required. The test, I realized, had already started to shape me. It made compassion not an exercise of charity, but a muscle that had to be flexed until it hurt. The phone buzzed, a single line from Marlowe. "They've expedited," she said, in a voice that suggested a courtroom's chill. "The court calendar moves fast when there is money at stake. Expect filings." "And what does that mean?" I asked. My words sounded thin. "It means your brothers have initiated a procedural tactic to preserve the estate while the litigation continues." It means, I thought, that I could do everything well and still be left with the shape of my father's plans and nothing else. Ellis stood then and put his hand on the file labeled with Mitchell Oil. "You don't have to take this alone," he said, "but you will have to decide what you want it to be." Day 16 lay ahead, 14 more to go. The war room was a cache of dangerous truths and smaller comforts. The shelter had been a place of surprise and humanity, and the city had already begun to teach me the grammar of listening. My brothers were sharpening their knives. The law was a cold, hungry beast in the wings. I pulled the brushes from the box and felt, for the first time in years, the tiny thrill of starting something messy and private. The test had given me back a hand I hadn't known I'd had, the ability to claim a small corner of the world, to give it paint and make it my own. The rain came again that night, kind in a different way, washing out the city's silver and making the barn smell like a place that could be rebuilt. I slept on a cot borrowed from Alice, a thin, honest sleep, the kind that promises little except tomorrow. Tomorrow, I would have to face subpoenas. Tomorrow, I would have to go back to the streets for another day. Tomorrow, the world outside might attempt to make me a spectacle or a martyr or a useful naive in their parlors. But for one quiet hour before sleep, I held a brush and thought about the man who had made me take this impossible test. I held a key and a ledger and a packet of videos that spoke in riddles. He had expected resistance. He had expected me to be furious. He had banked on the idea that provocation, if set up with care, could become an education. And somewhere beyond those calm intentions lay my brothers, tightening their legal screws, figuring which corner of our father's empire they could claim if I blinked. I closed my eyes and felt, counterintuitively, a small edge of readiness. I closed my eyes and felt, counterintuitively, a small edge of readiness. Day 16 slid into 17 like a secret being opened with a key that fit too easily. The barn had become my odd sanctuary, a place where hay smelled like history and brushes felt like contraband. I painted badly at first, stiff, cautious strokes that betrayed my fear of making something permanent. Tony taught me to mix burnt umber with a touch of ultramarine to find a color that looked like late afternoon. He was patient in a way the city and my family were not. He told me the secret of his sketching. You draw what you love because you learn to look for it. Meanwhile, the outside world spun its own narrative. The brothers' attorneys had filed motions faster than I could sleep. The court's calendar was a machine that chewed through days as if they were worthless paper. Marlowe, my father's lawyer, the cool, unblinking presence who had read the will aloud, kept me updated in tight emails that read like weather reports for a storm I could not shelter from. "Expect a response," she wrote. "We will counter. There are options to maintain your position while preserving evidence." Her last line, the one that kept me awake, was practical and forbidding. "We need to be ready to move on evidence. If they seek a conservator, you should be prepared to demonstrate capacity and purpose. Your completion of the test matters, and it will be watched." Watched. The word followed me like a shadow. There were cameras now, though not always the celebrity kind. A local news crew camped opposite the gate of the Lane estate for a week, their tripod a perpetual accusation. The stories were predictably salacious. "Heiress or harlot," read an online headline I swiped past in the shelter's common room. Another story made a point of my father's old philanthropic gifts and suggested that my refusal of privilege was performance art gone wrong. On day 18, Jenna called. Jenna was the kind of person who could bruise easily, but then smile through the scab. She was my half-sister, our father's daughter with a woman he'd loved softly and then left for somewhere else. And she had grown up less armored than I had. She lived on the outskirts of the family map, kept at arm's length by design and by circumstances. When I heard her voice, it wavered in a way that made me think of bridge supports humming. She said she'd been at a lawyer's office and Robert had been there too. His hand on her shoulder, she implied, had felt like a tug in a direction she hadn't chosen. I can't do this anymore, Kat, she said. They say you're making bad choices. What did they offer? I asked. A trust, a small one. They said I could get money now to take care of things. I half believed them because it's hard to decide what's right when you're tired. Her voice splintered. I love you, but maybe you're making this harder than it needs to be. The sting of betrayal was peculiar because it was so soft, like a hand that pressed rather than a knife that slit. I imagined Robert in a room with slick brochures and a man with a practice for selling people security. He had a way of making abandonment sound like prudence. You can choose whatever you need, I said, quieter than I intended. But remember, he wrote it to make us think. He knew you'd be careful, Jenna. That's why he made it hard. There was a silence, and then, I'll come see you, she said. I don't know when. When Jenna arrived a day later, she wore a coat too thin for the cold and held a paper coffee cup like an offering. Her hands trembled when they found mine. She admitted then that the feeling of being pulled by Robert had been strong. He'd convinced her the family needed stability and that my test would cost us everything. But she also said she'd seen the way the city moved under the jackets of those who had less, and something in her had recoiled at the thought of being sold just to get a check. She did not want to be that person. I'm scared, she confessed, not of being poor, but of being irrelevant to them. They always hide things in plain sight and say we're blind. Her words landed. The test was already doing what my father intended, whether he was right or cruel. It was making me visible in ways I had never been visible before, to strangers, to myself, to my family. Jenna's presence became one of those small, steadying things, like Ellis's hand on my shoulder. 2 beats defined day 19. In the morning, a man named not Priya. His name was Peter, a caseworker at a shelter I'd started to know, taught me how to fill out a form for temporary work. He had a dry smile and fingers that knew the rhythm of bureaucracy. He said paperwork could be both door and moat. He found me a day's worth of labor moving donations at a community center. Pay in cash, a receipt for my brackets of reality. The work was mundane and honest. I sorted blankets and stacked crates. I felt my wrists ache in a way that corresponded to a reality I was learning to accept. That afternoon, Ellis called a meeting in the war room and closed the door with a decisive click. We have something, he said, laying a single folder on the desk like a card on a table. Mitchell Oil, internal memo, 2010. They moved funds across accounts. There's a chain of emails indicating a side agreement. The problem is not just money, it's public liability. If we show this, it will force a conversation. Show it to whom? I asked. The press? The court? To the court, Marlowe said, who had come down from the city after a morning in chambers. If we can tie the transfers to the Mitchells' decisions on environmental mitigation, it gives us leverage to negotiate rather than be frozen. We'll need witnesses, documents, and a plan for the public reaction. Ellis's face hardened. There's another part, he said. Look at this. He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a printed copy of an email with a subject line that read, Pipeline Maintenance, Urgent Budget. The sender's name was familiar and poisons the air in the memory. Allen's in-house counsel copied to a Mitchell executive. My heart twitched. The war room was no longer just a cache of my father's meticulous life. It was a scalpel we were learning to use. At night, after work and after sorting blankets, I painted again. The canvas filled with an image I didn't plan. A woman sitting on an urban stoop, hands clasped, rain blurring the edges. The painting was ugly and honest and exactly what I needed. Tony sat with me and said, "You're not pretending anymore." He didn't say it as praise. He said it like an observation. It felt like progress. Then the midpoint hit us hard. Day 22 brought an injunction not just to freeze assets, but a motion that sought to have me declared a temporary incapacitated manager of the estate, pending the court's ruling. It was a procedural hammer. The brothers team argued that my voluntary decision to live without a fixed residence demonstrated a lack of capacity to manage assets. The language was clinical, but the effect was public and brutal. Marlowe read the papers with a face that showed fatigue, but also a legal hunger. "This is theater," she said. "They're using language to terrify, but it's not impossible to fight. We need your testimony, and we need to show you're doing this on purpose, with intent, and with plans in place for stewardship." "You mean, show my plan?" I asked. "Yes," she replied, "which you have. The war room documents, your statements, your father's recorded messages. They create a narrative that undermines the idea you're incompetent. It's a risk, but it's also an opportunity to show motive." Opposition came in more personal forms. Robert sent Jenna a letter that quoted my father, misused in a way that felt like twisting a line into a blade. He urged her to testify that the family had always been pragmatic and that my behavior would harm their interests. Robert's charisma worked like water in a pail, persistent and eroding. Jenna wavered. She nearly signed an affidavit that painted me as reckless. The day she told me about it, I felt something in my chest break and then mend in a new shape. I did not scream. I did not use the war room to smear her. Instead, I sat with Jenna on a crate of blankets and told her the truth. Not the polished version I might have offered in court, but the messy, honest one. "Dad wanted us to feel something," I said. "He thought he could make us feel it for him." That was both arrogant and maybe loving in the strangest way. "If you sign that affidavit, you will help them win the shape of this story. You'll make them the authors of our grief. You are allowed to be angry at him, but don't let them tell you who we are." She cried then, not loud, but in that way where the sound seems to come from your bones. "I was scared," she said. "I thought I could fix it for all of us. I thought money would stop the ache. But seeing you with that paint, it was different. You looked like you were building something that wasn't for them. I don't want to be part of that." She came to court the next day and sat with me through the hearing where the judge considered the motion. We did not win everything that day. Law is a slow, iterative thing. But the judge denied the request for a temporary conservator, in part because Marlowe presented the war room documents and my father's explicit wording in the will that established the administrator and the test as deliberate instruments. The judge's ruling was careful, and it bought us time. It felt like a small victory and also like a reprieve, not the end. Publicly, the hearings became a theater. Reporters photographed Jenna and me leaving the courthouse. In some shots, we looked like a contrast in choices, the privileged heiress transformed and the tentative sister in a coat. In the shelter, people who had once been just faces now nodded at me as if we shared a language. Maria, the woman who had explained the economy of invisibility, stood in the background and smiled in that knowing way she had. On day 24, one of my father's videos landed in a new folder Ellis labeled Day 24 for when you're tempted. The file name felt like a rope thrown to someone mid-fall. On the screen, Dad's voice was quieter than before. He looked like a man who had been practicing not to be afraid of his own reflection. "Catherine," he said, "temptation is a small, tidy thing. It is offered to you in paper and promises. People will try to pay for your silence. Those offers are just, I don't know, salves for their conscience. Accepting them buys you peace, but it also buries voices. If you take the money, you will be complicit in making the world the way you already know it is. I made mistakes. I made money in ways that left scars. This family business, they will try to rationalize it. You must ask, what does it mean to inherit someone's sins and someone's chances? He paused. There is a file you will find called remediationplan.doc. It's not complete. I wanted you to finish it, not because I was clever, but because I trusted you to have enough shame and courage to choose well. If you complete the 30 days, you'll have more than money. You'll have a duty. The video ended, and I turned off the laptop because I couldn't look at his face anymore without feeling the complicated physics of love and blame. Day 25 brought a twist I had not expected. A reporter, intelligent, with a pen that didn't tremble and an interest that felt like curiosity rather than consumption, asked to interview me for a long piece. I said yes. The interview was not a performance. It was a conversation about fear and privilege and the odd human economy of regret. I did not flatter myself. I was honest about my resentment and my slow moves towards something else. I spoke about the war room in measured terms, about the need to uncover truth without using it as a weapon to humiliate. I spoke haltingly about art. Two things happened after that piece ran. Donations began to come to local shelters with notes that referenced my name. And a woman from an environmental nonprofit called to offer support in reviewing the war room's findings. People had opinions, good, bad, and mercenary, but they also had resources that could be aligned with my father's grudging sense of responsibility. Aligning them required a moral spine I did not know I had. On day 27, the brothers' legal team made a final aggressive move. They filed a motion for expedited discovery, aiming to peer into the war room's materials and, in effect, weaponize them against us by forcing us to turn over documents we had intended to present under controlled circumstances. It was a common legal tactic to force mistakes. Marlowe called it the dragnet. She was blunt. If we put everything on the table now, the press will chew it up. It will make the case about spectacle rather than substance. We had to decide, strike for the jugular now by releasing evidence that could incriminate and shame, or hold close and risk procedural penalties. The risk felt like standing at a cliff. Ellis, who knew more about the estate and my father's moods than anyone, argued for strategy. We present selectively. We leak nothing. The court will want context. We'll push the narrative that this is about stewardship, not revenge. We began to assemble a targeted package, a dossier that linked questionable transfers to the Mitchells and to decisions that had allowed cutting corners on environmental safeguards. We arranged independent analyses from the nonprofit and a trusted consultant who could speak in numbers and not rhetoric. The plan was not to destroy. It was to force negotiation under the light of truth. Day 29 felt as if it might be the day everything unraveled. The court scheduled oral arguments that could trigger settlement or prolong litigation for years. The brothers pushed for public disclosure. Their team dangled the promise of a headline-grabbing confession if we would only make the war room's documents public. The choice fell to me in a way I'd never imagined. To fight the old way, swinging for retribution and exposure, or to adopt the stewardship my father had tried, awkwardly and often cruelly, to teach. I had never been averse to winning, but victory like a trophy on a mantle had begun to feel cheap. The nights on the streets, the people who had shown me the economy of compassion, had changed me. I wanted an outcome that would not simply reverse the ledger, but would create a different ledger altogether. In the small hours before the hearing, I walked the lane behind the barn and breathed in cold air that smelled like pine and something chemical in the distance. I remembered my father's hands, folded in the study. I remembered his voice telling me he had done what he had thought necessary. I also remembered Maria's simple comment about keeping feet dry and that man in the safety vest offering me shelter blanket and a sandwich. I decided to make a move neither of my brothers expected. We would not go for outright exposure, nor would we disappear beneath procedural technicalities. We would bring a third path, negotiation with teeth, legal teeth, but moral clarity, using the war room to demand an enforceable stewardship plan. At the hearing, Marlowe presented our package. She spoke not with theatrical indignation, but with the quiet of a good lawyer. Facts, dates, names, and the nonprofit's analysis. She asked the judge for a protective order that would allow selective disclosure to relevant parties and the court while preventing a free-for-all in the press. She proposed mediation with a neutral panel to resolve distribution of assets under the will, citing the estate's explicit environmental and stewardship language. Something surprising happened. The judge, whose face had been unreadable for days, leaned forward and said, "This case is not simply about money. It's about the future of property and community. If there are environmental stakes, I would prefer mediation to litigation." He ordered a limited discovery and set a schedule for mediation, not open war. The ruling was cautious and nuanced, and it gave us a forum to use the war room on our terms. In the mediations that followed, truths slid out like reluctant actors. We produced a ledger that tied Mitchell accounts to projects where remediation had been postponed and environmental protections loosely enforced. The Mitchells' lawyers fought, of course. They had a dossier of their own. But when confronted with independent analyses that showed likely long-term liability and reputational risk, the math shifted from theft to reckoning. It would be false to say the Mitchells' power dissolved that afternoon. They were clever and had allies, but they were not indestructible. In mediation, facing the possibility of a court ordering not just restitution, but a public remediation plan and an independent oversight board, they began to negotiate. The talks were ugly at times, sharp words, threats of countersuits, cheap barbs about family loyalty. But negotiations are a form of translation. They force vocabulary into something each side can manage. I insisted on 3 conditions that surprised both Marlowe and Ellis with how calmly I stated them. First, an independent stewardship board composed of environmental experts, community representatives, and a fiduciary that reported to the court for a fixed period. Second, the establishment of a community trust using a portion of the estate to fund shelters and arts program and remediation. And third, enforceable environmental protections written into the deed with heavy penalties for noncompliance. It was not naive to hope for all of it. It was, if anything, practical. If you force those who control capital to internalize liability and create structures that require transparency, you change incentives. I wanted not only to inherit, but to convert inheritance into architecture, structures that survived individual wills. The final negotiation was painful and messy. Ellis, stood with me through threats and backdoor offers. Jenna held a hand on my back when I felt unsteady. Tony drew while I spoke. His sketches hung on the mediation room's wall like quiet witnesses. Finally, the Mitchells agreed to a settlement that weaved together our demands with a concession. The estate would remain in the family's control, but under the stewardship plan we proposed, with a large portion allocated to the Community Trust and Remediation Fund. They fought over language. Lawyers parsed commas like bone. The agreement mushroomed into stacks of pages that made the war room look modest. But when the last signatures were inked, when the words "in trust" and "enforceable" settled on the paper, there was a fatigue so complete it felt like peace. Not triumphal victory, not revenge, but a long negotiated compromise that preserved the estate's integrity and forced accountability. There was one more gift my father left, waiting like a secret for the final act. In the war room, behind a folder labeled "Final" for Catherine only, I found a small flash drive and a handwritten note. "For your last night, Cat." I had not intended to watch it before the mediation concluded, to avoid seeing his face pup at the outcome. But that night, the barn was quiet, and the world outside felt like someone holding their breath. I clicked the file. He sat in a chair I recognized, the same one from the first video, but there was a softness now, as if he had gotten somewhere near softness before the end. "Cat," he said. He called me Cat, as if the name could close years of distance and bruise. "If you're watching this, it means you chose to finish. Maybe you are furious. Maybe you hate me. That's fine. I don't need your forgiveness, but I wanted to say something I should have said when I could make you sit still." He looked at the camera and then away, a man searching for the right sentence. "I made money in ways that left fractures," he said. "I convinced myself that power was a kind of mercy. It isn't. I wanted you to understand the people who live around what we built. I wanted you to know how close our houses sit to other people's deserts." He reached into his pocket and drew out a folded paper. I recognized the handwriting, mine, in childish scrawl from a birthday card decades ago. He smiled, a brief and terrible smile. "I was afraid you'd never be sorry for things you couldn't see," he said, "so I tried to engineer a way to make you feel them. Maybe that's a mistake, maybe it's selfish, but I hoped it would make you a steward instead of a spender. If you can do that, Kat, if you can look at the world and decide to give it rules that don't always favor you, then my money will have been put where it could do something other than comfort me." He paused. "Do with it what you will. Don't make my method more important than the work." The recording ended, and the barn seemed to breathe out with me. I had wanted a neat apology or $1 million check mailed to cover up everything. Instead, I had gotten an invitation and a challenge: convert what we had into a different kind of machine. The last night of the 30 days, I did not spend on a bench or in a shelter. The will's strictures required no fixed residence. The administrators had clarified that rotating stays with verified charities, documented presence outdoors, and no use of personal staff counted as compliant. It led me to an odd, lawful choreography: nights in the shelter, nights at a community-run studio that offered residency spaces, a night in my old car — I rented a cheap one and slept with a blanket — and one night under the stars on the Laneland in a borrowed sleeping bag beside the newly planted buffer where the creek had been once, dyed a bleak color years ago. I lay on my back looking at a sky that felt big in the way you only notice when you stop trying to control it. The 30 days had been more than endurance. They had been a re-education. I had learned the language of waiting, of hunger that was a teacher rather than a punishable offense. I had learned to listen to stories without immediately translating them into capital. I had learned to see my father more honestly, as a man who had tried to fix a son he could never change, using the only tools he trusted: tests and plans. When the 30th day passed and the administrator confirmed compliance, documents signed, witness affidavits in order, an observer who had tracked my whereabouts as required, the relief I felt was not the giddy triumph I had imagined. It was quiet and almost moral, like the precise relief of taking off wet shoes. But the story did not end with signature ink drying. The mediation had guided us to a settlement that preserved family control but demanded oversight: a stewardship board, a remediation fund, and a trust for community work. The estate's oil holdings were to be managed under strict environmental covenants, transitioning to alternative income streams where feasible. The conservation easements and land use covenants were put into deed, legal architecture that ensured the estate could still earn, but not at the cost of a community's health. In practical terms, the Mitchells were required to contribute to remediation and allow third-party audit. Their equity stake would remain, but it would be under compliance monitoring. The community trust received an initial endowment, and the arts program, my arts program, was funded. There was a clause that made my role official: executor of the community trust, and a seat on the stewardship board for a limited term, with the understanding that I would hire experts and empower community voices. It was not a cinematic victory. It was a settlement, legal, messy, and imperfect. But it made room for repair in ways that raw revenge could not. I slept badly the first night the agreement was signed because legal settlements are not absolutions, they are frameworks. But I also slept like a person who had started to keep a promise. The months after the agreement were the hard work no one ever dramatizes. Setting up the trust required governance details, bylaws, independent auditors, selection process for community reps. The environmental remediation required engineers, patiently filed plans, and a large ledger of budgets that made me dizzy. Working through it taught me something steady. Stewardship is mostly administration. It is repeated attention, unglamorous and necessary. I hired a director for the arts program, an old friend of Tony's from a program he'd attended, someone who knew grants and knew how to start a class with nothing but a sheet of paper and a charcoal stick. Tony became an assistant in the community studio, and Jenna helped with outreach to schools. Maria's daughters were reunited with her faster than bureaucracy should have allowed, and she became a volunteer at the shelter the trust funded. Little turnings. Ellis stayed. He took the title of estate manager with a new wrinkle. He was also my chief advisor in the stewardship board. He did not love the spotlight. He loved the land and the horses and the way an honest ledger can keep promises honest. One afternoon in the barn, he told me a story about my father I hadn't heard before. How, when he was a young man, my father had once scooped a small town into a foundation, but then sold the local mill for profit and never told anyone that the sale would mean job losses. Ellis said he'd watched my father pay the foundation his conscience had planned as if it were penance. He thought he could balance everything with money, Ellis said. Maybe he was right in some ways and wrong in others. He wanted you to not be both. My art changed. The paintings grew more honest. I painted a series called Shelters, where I attempted to give dignity to corners of the city I had only recently learned to see. I gave one to the shelter that had taken me in on night 2. They hung it in the dining room, where it caught afternoon sunlight and made the space look like a place worthy of being seen. There were losses. The brothers remained brothers, and relationships did not plutzly mend into a cliché of family healing. Robert called infrequently, always for business reasons. Alan avoided long conversations, or when he spoke, his voice slid into a man who had learned to barter affection for convenience. I did not expect reconciliation to be a single scene. It was a long, tertiary process. But there were moments, awkward dinners where we attempted to talk about horses and not money, a slow exchange of books that suggested things could be different. The war room became a resource not of blackmail, but of accountability. We used the documents to memo a plan for remediation and to instruct the stewardship board. The war room, once a secret waiting to explode, became a repository for a different kind of truth, a starting point for what we might do with power and money. Months later, I stood in a small community center on the edge of the Lane property for the opening of the arts program supported by the trust. The room was crowded with people who had helped, caseworkers, volunteers, a woman who had been given a grant to study water testing, a row of kids holding paint-stained brushes like flags. Tony co-taught the first class. Maria volunteered at the registration table. Jenna had organized the catering. I gave a short speech, not the kind that seduces press, but the kind that gathers attention like a hand. I said simply that inheritance had taught me to listen. I said that my father had tried to engineer that listening in a way I had resented and learned from, and that maybe the point was that we must decide for ourselves what to do with what we inherit. No big lessons, no sanctimony, just a quiet insistence that people are worth more than profit. Afterward, a woman from a local nonprofit pulled me aside. She had been homeless for years before a program connected her to permanent housing. She told me of the first night she'd slept indoors with nothing to fear of rain. Her eyes were bright and slightly incredulous, as if the memory still surprised her. "We need this," she said. "We need people with money to stop pretending the system benefits everyone. Thank you for," she searched for a word, "for making it harder for them to ignore us." There were photographers who tried to catch me looking like a vision. I walked past them and felt like a person who'd learned not to own an image. That felt freeing. The estate required hands. I launched a restoration of the creek banks with a team of environmentalists who designed a plan that used native plants to slow runoff, a remediation budget we could present to the board, and a monitoring schedule the company had to fund annually. The trust set up a scholarship for kids from the area to study biology and art. Little by little, decisions turned into actions. On a quiet morning, months after the will had first been read, I returned to the barn and found an envelope tucked under the ledge of the war room desk. Inside was a note in my father's hand, short and precise, and a photograph of him as a young man, his face less lined, all of him a possibility. "If you found this," he'd written, "it means you followed in the way you chose. I cannot unmake my methods, but I hoped, selfishly, you'd be better. Use the money badly if you must, but try not to. For what it's worth, I loved you." The photograph was both more and less than an apology. It was an endnote, a man trying to reach his child across the messy architecture of his life. I folded it and slid it into my wallet because that felt right. The months that followed were a new rhythm. There were board meetings and audits and artists teaching kids to draw the creek. There were nights when I sat alone in the barn and painted until my fingers cramped, and other nights when I walked the land with Ellis and learned which trees had been planted when and which hedgerows needed tending. I learned the technical language of remediation grants and the wobbly poetry of community organizing. I had not planned to become this kind of woman. It found me. On a late spring evening, I opened the barn and stepped outside. A breeze moved over the fields, tangling with the scent of new leaves and late rain. My painting easel sat on the porch, its canvas blank and waiting. Tony had left a cup of tea on the railing. Jenna had hung a small sign that read, "Artists and neighbors welcome." I walked out to where the creek ran slow and took a breath that tasted like a bargain kept. The land had been scarred by extraction and then stitched with a slow, patient hand. That was a metaphor that could be abused for sermons, but it felt, to me, like a ledger finally being balanced. Not perfectly, but with effort. I found Maria at the small shelter we'd helped fund, organizing bins of clothes. She laughed when she saw me, an honest, wide laugh. "You are still ridiculous," she said, "but you paint well." "I'm learning," I answered. She tilted her head. "You know what I want?" she asked. "I want someone to come in and teach my little girls to mix paint like you, to see color, to know that they could be more than what they were told." "Then we'll teach them," I said, "and we'll pay you to teach them too." We hugged, and the hug felt like a small architecture of trust. The test had not been a glory. It had been a painful recalibration, a legal inconvenience, a public humiliation at times, and a slow education. My brothers were still in the picture, complicated and human and sometimes cruel, but there had been a shift in the terms we all operated under. Money had been recontextualized, structures had been put in place. The war room had been used not as a blade for revenge, but as a scalpel for necessary surgery. On an afternoon when the sun looked like washed linen, Ellis and I walked the perimeter fence and opened a gate to a small paddock where a mare stood with the patience of a thing that lives on a schedule, not a ledger. I fed her a carrot and sat on the fence while Ellis talked about maintenance budgets and volunteers. He mentioned casually that my father would have liked the way I'd handled things. You did something not many would, he said. You turned his will into something he couldn't have imagined. Maybe that's enough. I thought of my father's last recordings and his test like a complicated recipe, bitter, precise, and oddly sincere. I could still be angry at his method. I could still grieve the way he loved. But anger had softened into an engine that powered decisions rather than a fuel for fuel's sake. The final months blurred into a steady process of building and listening. We stood before the stewardship board months later and ratified a perpetual covenant that tied the estate's oil interests to a strict oversight regime and mandated transitions when alternative incomes were feasible. It was imperfect and long. That was the point. The documents made my father's name less a brand and more a responsibility. On the 1-year anniversary of his death, I stood in the sanctuary we had restored on the Lane land. We held a simple event, a small exhibition of community art, a few speeches, a potluck. People I had met on the streets were there, so were some of the old board members and a Mitchell representative who avoided my eyes and stayed close to legal counsel. There was a tiny plaque where new trees had been planted, names of donors, and a note of dedication. The plaque read simply, "For continuity, for care." After the last person had left and the sky had taken on the color of turning pages, I walked to the barn and sat on the porch with a cup of tea. It had been a year of small, lumbering choices. I had inherited not only property and account numbers, but a burdened set of priorities that asked me to be careful in ways my father had not always modeled. It was a weight I could accept. I took out the photograph he had left and put it in a frame. I did not forgive him in any theatrical sense. Forgiveness is a private ledger. I made a choice to understand rather than to erase. That was enough. If you asked me then whether I would do it again, live homeless for 30 days in exchange for everything, I would say truthfully that I do not know. The pain of those nights is not something I desire to repeat. But I also knew that without being pushed to the brink, I might still have arranged my life like a fortress, safe, ordered, and deaf to what was outside the gate. In the end, the inheritance became a set of opportunities and constraints, the ability to fund change, the duty to do so transparently, and a legal architecture that made negligence costly. It was not salvation, nor was it a golden ticket to moral purity. It was a framework requiring ongoing decisions. I keep painting. Sometimes I sell a piece and put the proceeds back into the trust. I teach an occasional class where Tony helps, and once in a while a student from the program will show me a line they've drawn and ask if it's good. I tell them the truth. It's yours. Keep making it. When people ask me what my father meant by making me live homeless for 30 days, I tell them what I think now, that he wanted shock to be a teacher. He was brutal and, in his way, hopeful. He hoped discomfort would translate into care. Whether that was the best method is not for me to decide. What matters is what you do when you have been given both a lesson and the means to act on it. I do not want my life to be a morality play. I want it to be a ledger that includes mistakes and attempts at repair. I have found that stewardship is not about having all the answers, but about arranging structures that require you to keep trying. If you read this and wonder what you would do, if someone handed you a choice like the one I was given, tell me, would you choose the discomfort to shape you? Or would you take the clean, comfortable path and hope the world would get better without you getting involved? I don't expect easy answers. I only know that living through those 30 days broke something and then taught me to mend something else. It taught me to take responsibility when the easiest thing would have been to look away. It taught me that wealth, when tethered to accountability, can become a slow kind of repair. So here is what I chose: to hold the money lightly and the responsibility tightly, to fund places that keep people dry and warm, to support artists who teach kids to see, to make the creek less toxic, and to require those who profit from the land to pay for its healing. Not because I wanted to be lauded, but because I couldn't look at the world and pretend it was not mine to influence. If you've ever wondered what you would do for an inheritance like mine, you can tell me in the comments. If this story made you think about the ways we use what we're given, subscribe. There are more stories and more lessons in the messy archive of other people's choices. And if you're somewhere that feels like a bench in the rain, know this. Someone once handed me a foil blanket and a sandwich, and, in doing so, changed the arc of my life. Small acts matter. They are the stitches in any true repair.